Hello, this is Joy Ackerman, and welcome to the Conservation Psychology webinar series. I'm speaking to you from Antioch University, New England, from our Conservation Psychology Institute. Today's topic is facilitating pro-environmental behavior, and the overview of the research will be presented by Abby Abrash-Walton. Abby, I think you're in charge of advancing the slides, so why don't we move ahead to the webinar logistics. You should be connected via audio broadcast. You don't need to call in. We're also recording this webinar, and it'll be posted to the Antioch website shortly. I think you'll receive an email as registered participants of the webinar with a link to it. If you have any questions, check out the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a Q&A box, and that's where we would like you to submit questions that you have for the presenter. Use the Q&A section. If you're having problems, you can use another tool, which is the chat section that looks like a little talk bubble, and send a message, and Terry, who's our background person, will be checking in on that. All right, so let's do some introductions. I'm Joy Ackerman. I'll be moderating today. I'll say a little bit more about myself shortly. Abby Abrash-Walton will be leading the webinar topic, and both Abby and I will moderate your questions after the webinar. So let's have a look at Abby's background, along with others here at Antioch. Abby's active in the Conservation Psychology Institute, but she also co-directs our Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience. They've got a great conference coming up later this spring, so you might want to check that out. Abby directs our master's program in advocacy for social justice and sustainability, and she's also been a real mover and shaker on campus and elsewhere in terms of sustainability and social justice initiatives. Her own research focuses on change leadership, and she's really interested in promoting pro-environmental behavior at multiple scales, and really interested in the way that our values can translate into effective action and how to draw on people's values to do that. A little bit about me. I'm also a core faculty member in our Department of Environmental Studies, and have been active with this Center for Conservation Psychology, and along with Abby and Libby McCann in directing our Conservation Psychology Institutes and these webinar programs. Before we get started with Abby's presentation, I want to give a quick plug for our next webinar and our next webinar presenter. Brooke Tully is actually a graduate or an alum of our Conservation Psychology Institute, and she's going to be talking with us about creating a conservation movement, drawing on diffusion of innovation theory to help us think about how movements start, and about the power of social norms and how to draw on those in order to foster behavioral change and greater adoption of conservation behaviors. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Abby to start her presentation.
Thank you very much, Joy, and hi everybody. I am looking forward to Brooke Tully's webinar presentation next month. Diffusion of innovation theory is a great one to dig deep into, and social movements too. Hi everybody, I am here to talk to you today to give you a brief overview of relevant research relating to facilitating pro-environmental behavior. And I wanted to just start out with referencing back to the understanding that the integrity of conservation psychology as a field of research and practice is really grounded in rigorous research. You know, Carol Saunders, in proposing this new field, emphasized that it is the scientific study of reciprocal relationships between humans and the rest of nature, and it has a particular focus on how to encourage conservation of the natural world. So the field's success really depends upon researchers' ability to identify theory, methods, and applied recommendations and techniques that yield demonstrable and effective sustainability outcomes. And I was looking back at some of the original articles in Human Ecology Review, wherein there was a special issue done at the beginning of people beginning to talk about and think about this emerging field of conservation psychology. And this quote from Solavsky, I think, really hones in on what is at the core of my presentation today. He said, what conservation practitioners need are trained people, useful methods, and tested knowledge that they can use to improve their day-to-day work. And he asked this question, can conservation psychology create general and yet non-trivial principles that will be of use to practitioners? To me, he wrote, the most fertile ground lies in behavioral modification. It would be nice to get beyond the theory and get down to nuts and bolts principles as to the specific steps a project would need to take to effectively modify specific behaviors in a specific set of people under specific conditions. So that's the challenge for the field. And, you know, globally, we know that we've now entered what geologists and others are referring to as the Anthropocene epoch, and that we as human beings, Homo sapiens, play a really central role in terms of determining environmental outcomes, and that environmental solutions really depend upon human behavior change. So it's a very important thing for us to be looking at what does research tell us about facilitating pro-environmental behavior change. And I'm sure that many of you on this broadcast today are thinking about that very directly in your own work in a variety of different settings as practitioners. So just to get us started, I wanted to highlight some of the publications that are out there that we put a particular emphasis on here in the work that we do. One is this publication, Influencing Conservation Action, that Nicole Ardoin and others put out about 5 years ago, looking at what research says about environmental literacy, behavior, and conservation results. It's a great resource. Also, a newer publication that isn't environmentally specific, but comes out of research and work in Australia, Social Marketing and Behavior Change Models, Theory and Applications. There are a number of good case studies in there, and it's a good way of looking at the way in which research focusing on human health might have directly relevant applications for considering environmental health and conservation outcomes. Of course, the second edition of Conservation Psychology, which is the seminal work in the field, presents other really effective insights into rigorous research in this field. And then another one that we use here at Antioch is Nikki Hare's Psychology for a Better World. And again, there Nikki is looking at strategies to inspire sustainability and drawing very directly on a range of key research studies that have been done about how to really facilitate pro-environmental behavior. Lastly, in this area, I want to just draw attention to two published studies that I think are most helpful in particular in getting a meta-analysis of the field. And the first one here is a meta-analysis by Osbaldiston and Schott, which was published back in 2012, and which looks at more than 100 different experimental research studies focusing on pro-environmental behavior. And I'll come back to some of their findings in a little bit. Osbaldiston went on to publish a year later this piece, Synthesizing the Experiments and Theories of Conservation Psychology. And that, again, is another very useful overview of the existing research in the field. And these publications are all ones that that we hear reference and that we would want to draw your attention to.
Andy, I'm sorry to interrupt. We just had a couple requests to see if you could speak just a little louder.
Sure.
Okay,
I will do my best to project. Thank you, Terry, and
You're
thanks
welcome.
to those of you who asked for me to project my voice more loudly. I hope this is better. I want to key in on one of the most important findings from the studies that I just referenced, and that is that most experimental research on conservation behaviors has focused on a very small set of behaviors: recycling, conservation of energy, water, and gasoline. These are behaviors principally at the household level. And what we know to be true is that the challenges that we face in terms of environmental outcomes really also challenge us to look at other levels of facilitating pro-environmental behavior. So while facilitating pro-environmental behavior at an individual level is certainly an important approach to achieving environmental solutions, change also needs to be taking place at other levels, what some researchers and scholars call the meso and macro levels of change. So really looking at where we can focus on achieving significant environmental solutions through collective action and aggregating individual behaviors is really important. So with that, I want to turn to one of the biggest challenges that I think everyone agrees we face, and that is warming of the planet. And we know that multiple lines of scientific evidence confirm that the predominant contributor to climate change is combustion of fossil fuels by humans. So ending the burning of fossil fuels is a critical pro-environmental behavior change. And in the study that I'm going to give you as an example today, I conceptualized fossil fuel divestment as a specific pro-environmental behavior change. So again, looking at where we can aggregate individual level behavior into collective action as a critical locus for pro-environmental behavior change. So let me do a quick background about fossil fuel divestment and the phenomenon that I'm going to talk about in the study that I'm going to give you as an example. So divestment has been organized through a lot of different channels, but it emerged as a new pro-environmental behavior change in 2011 and began on college campuses in the United States. And it has grown as a movement to, at this stage, include more than 780 organizations worldwide and some almost 60,000 individuals who have taken a commitment to divest, or basically to sell off, any financial instruments, primarily stocks, that they might hold that are invested in fossil fuel extraction companies. And the screenshot here that I'm showing you gives you a sense of, at an organizational level, which specific types of organizations have made this public commitment to divest. So you might see your organization, your type of organization represented here, but if you see the pink line, philanthropic foundations are the greatest number of groups within this landscape that have committed to fossil fuel divestment. And so in thinking about how to rigorously study pro-environmental behavior change at an organizational level, at a sectoral level, I decided to do a study focused on philanthropic foundation leadership here in the United States, and what explained the readiness of leaders of these organizations to commit to fossil fuel divestment. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But to give you a sense of the scale, and again thinking about aggregating individual and organizational level behaviors, this is the scale of the impact of the fossil fuel divestment movement so far. And I will tell you that that $5.5 trillion of total assets that have been committed to or actually divested from fossil fuels is now, just in the last several months, inching up closer to $6 trillion. To give you a sense of scale, 5.5 trillion, which is the last documented figure from Arabella Advisors, and from Divest Invest from 2017, fossil fuel divested assets of 5.5 trillion represent about 8% of global stock market value. So when we think about facilitating pro-environmental behavior change, it's important to really, I think, in designing research and defining problems, to look at where we might achieve the greatest change with the single most focused definition of a behavior change. And that's why I selected fossil fuel divestment to focus on in my own research. So again, the central question was, what explained US-based private foundation leaders' readiness to pursue fossil fuel divestment by their institutions? There were a series of sub-questions in the study, and I'll give you a site for the study towards the end of this broadcast. But you know, my research question was really based on the fact that behavior change is challenging. We all know this. And institutional investors have conventionally relied on fossil fuel holdings as a mainstay of investment portfolios. In fact, most financial advisors will tell you that keeping a certain percentage of your investments in the energy sector is important. So changing this investing behavior could be really, really challenging. And so in thinking about how to explore this question, I turned to a particular model of behavior change, the trans-theoretical model of behavior change, that has been used in research, empirical research, in a number of different countries over the course of the last 35 or so years. And most of the behaviors that have been studied using this model have been health behaviors. In fact, the model grew out of Jim Prochaska and his colleagues' work in the 1970s, looking at how to understand the success of individuals' ability to cease their tobacco use without any apparent external intervention. And in seeking to answer that question, Jim and his colleagues developed the trans-theoretical model of behavior change. They and other researchers have gone on to conduct many, many studies applying the TTM, as I'll refer to it for the remainder of this broadcast, to a range of different behaviors. And other researchers globally have picked up on the TTM as an integrative psychological model that can be helpful for understanding and facilitating behavior change. So I want to just give you a sense of, again, why I thought this would be helpful for looking at pro-environmental behavior change. There are a number of different pro-environmental behavior researchers, including some thought leaders within conservation psychology, who have posited the utility of applying the TTM to pro-environmental behavior. But at the time that I was developing my research design, there was very little peer-reviewed empirical research that explicitly applied a TTM theoretical and methodological approach to understanding and facilitating pro-environmental behavior. And so my thought was that the TTM might fill an important gap in current pro-environmental behavior theory and applied research, particularly by focusing on the appropriate facilitative processes that can support behavior change. And I'll talk about that when I explain the model in a bit more detail. So let's look at the different constructs of the TTM. TTM is a shorthand referred to quite often by others as the stages of change model. But what I hope to convey to you today is that the TTM is actually more inclusive than just this focus on stages of readiness to engage in a new behavior. That is certainly one of the key constructs of the model. And what it suggests is that for any given behavior change, an individual is going to go through different stages of readiness to engage in that new behavior. The first being pre-contemplation. And pre-contemplation Contemplation is the stage at which a person might not even be aware that a new behavior is possible, or the person might not be interested in the behavior as an option, or might actually feel resistant to the behavior, feel a lack of confidence about their ability to engage in that behavior. Contemplation is the next stage, where the individual is considering the new behavior and weighing the pros and the cons represented by the decisional balance construct in the model, thinking about whether or not to actually engage in this new behavior. Preparation, the next stage, is the stage at which the individual has committed to engaging in the behavior and is actually preparing, taking steps to do so. And then action stage is where the individual is doing the new behavior. After 6 months, the individual enters maintenance. That's the term for that final of the 5 stages. And that's the stages of readiness to engage in new behavior construct. Decisional balance, again, is the weighing of the pros and cons of engaging in the behavior. Self-efficacy is a term that psychologists are well acquainted with. It's the idea that a person feels confident in their ability to engage in the behavior. And one of the things that the TTM offers that other models of behavior change do not is this 4th construct of processes of change. And that identifies 10 specific processes that can facilitate a person's movement through the stages of readiness. And I'll come back to that when I go into detail about my study. What I want to conclude this slide by saying is that the TTM, in my view and in my experience of applying it, addresses a critical question within the conservation psychology research field concerning pro-environmental behavior change, and that is what specific tools to employ and when. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, I had cited for you earlier the Osbaldiston and Schott study that came out in 2012, and that was the meta-analysis that looked at more than 100 different experimental studies focusing on pro-environmental behavior. And what you see there in the right column of this table are the 10 most effective pro-environmental behavior interventions and treatments that Osbaldiston and Schott identified in their study. I'm showing you this table in 2 slides because it takes up too much room for just one. But what I'm attempting to do here is to do a comparison of the TTM's processes of change, that 4th construct in the model, and how they relate to what Osbaldiston and Schott have found in their meta-analysis about the 10 most effective interventions and treatments. So what would be called in the TTM consciousness raising, crosswalks with justifications and instructions. In the TTM model, environmental reevaluation, again, crosswalks with justifications. Self-reevaluation is most similar to cognitive dissonance in terms of typical interventions and treatments. And then the other TTM processes of change, you can see the crosswalk here: social liberation with social modeling or making it easy, self-liberation with goal setting and commitment setting, counter-conditioning with making it easy, reinforcement management with rewards, and stimulus control with prompts and feedback. And one of the important processes of change in the TTM model that doesn't appear in other pro-environmental behavior research is this facilitative change process of helping relationships. And I think what's helpful to remember about the TTM as a theoretical and conceptual model is that it is actually used by psychologists in many different countries around the world to effectively support the movement of individuals through a behavior change process. And that helping relationships process of change is a critical difference, I think, in what we see between the TTM and the research focusing use of the TTM to facilitating behavior change and what we see in most other pro-environmental behavior research. So let me talk with you about the specific study that I did and how I used the TTM as a way of analyzing the data that came out of this study and what I think it can offer us. So, as I said before, a behavior change process conceptualized using the TTM suggests that individuals move through different stages of readiness. And for my population, I was looking at the leaders of US-based foundations that had publicly committed to divesting all of their fossil fuel holdings. So I was looking at their movement from contemplation of divestment through preparation, action, and maintenance. And the research design had two data sets and two phases. Phase one was defined in this way: US-based private independent foundation as defined by the US Internal Revenue Service, and public commitment to divest the foundation's institutional assets from fossil fuels. That's what defined the study population in terms of the organizational level. And phase two was in-depth semi-structured interviews with representatives of these foundations. And the criteria I used were that the participant needed to be publicly named as the foundation's representative in their public divestment commitment, or to serve in a formal top leadership role. So looking at the population of organizations that I studied, this gives you a sense of the scope. It was a mix of organizations on the west and east coasts of the United States, as well as in the mountain states and in the Midwest. And the range of institutional assets that they controlled and were stewarding ranged from as low as $500,000 to $1 billion. That was the range. And for the interview stage of this research, here you see descriptors of the participants. So I was interviewing people serving as executive directors, CEOs, trustees, and often the board chair. So looking ahead, the TTM was useful in understanding the stage of change from contemplation to preparation at an organizational level. That was one level of my analysis. And here are some of the findings from that phase of analysis. And basically, I was looking at what explained the divestment decision. And there were three basic types of divestment decisions that these organizations went through. One I categorized as an easy decision, and there you see some of the factors that influenced the ease of the decision for the organization. The second type was an engaged decision, and the third was a challenging decision. And it's important to say that while the median time frame for a decision to divest was 5 months, decision timeframes in this population of organizations ranged from 1 day, and in fact, not just 1 day, 1 hour, to 1 year. There were some organizations for which the divestment decision was so easy that they were able to arrive at it within the span of one board meeting. And other organizations, the ones that took up to a year, often faced a much more challenging decision timeframe. So these were some of the factors that contributed to the ease or the difficulty, the challenge of reaching a divestment decision. I also did an analysis looking at the individual leader divestment commitment and implementation behavior change process. And this is a good visual that helps to understand what these individual leaders were thinking about, doing, and feeling at different stages of moving from contemplation through preparation, action, and then on to maintenance. And so one of the things I want to highlight, again, is coming back to the TTM and its emphasis on helping relationships as an important process of change. And what you see at the top there, and this was true for all 4 stages of readiness, engaging effective support from investment advisors was consistently important in terms of moving from contemplation through preparation to action and then to maintenance. And the other thing that I want to highlight here is the role of positive emotions about making the commitment to divest, which you see under preparation. So when I asked participants to talk about the decision to divest, one of the most notable things that they described was these positive emotions that were unleashed by their decision. They described feeling elation, relief, liberation, satisfaction, and pride. And these positive emotions amplified their commitment and appeared to provide energy to them to move from preparation to action. One executive said about the decision to divest, it felt exhilarating. It's just really one of those moments where you put your money where your mouth is. I feel very proud of them as a board and us as an institution. So moving on to the second construct of decisional balance, what the TTM from a theoretical standpoint suggests is that, and this is not rocket science, the pros of making a behavior change need to outweigh the cons. And in my particular study, this is what you can see in terms of the balance of pros versus cons as these individual leaders moved through the stages of readiness to change. So number one, in terms of the benefit or the pro of making this change, was a desire to align investing with mission, vision, values, and grant making of the organization. And what surprised me was that that was the number one benefit that these leaders saw to making the change. The second and less frequently mentioned pro was the desire to address climate change, which I had assumed would be the predominant reason for their commitment to divestment. And then you see some of the other pros: desire to exercise leadership, the efficacy and feasibility of divestment based on their personal past activist experience, and lastly, the view of divestment as an investment opportunity that would send a market signal that would in turn catalyze new investment services and products and influence public policy. And on the con side, you see the time involved in researching and implementing the decision that was viewed as a con by participants, and also the potential for decreased performance of the investment portfolio. So those were the two cons. Now, the third construct in the TTM focuses on self-efficacy. And so part of my analysis was looking at the factors that affected individual participants' sense of self-efficacy. And there you see the list. What I want to hone in on again is this particular factor, changing investment advisors. And again, with the notion that helping relationships are so important to any kind of behavior change process. In the specific example of fossil fuel divestment, changing investment advisors turned out to be one of the key factors affecting their sense of self-efficacy and being able to make the change. One executive said, "We made the very tough decision that we needed to exit from the relationship with our investment advisors and find a new outsourced chief investment officer who would be more able to help us realize our mission-aligned investing goals." Another leader whose organization was still in the preparation stage said, "We're with this traditional company. We're not the only ones talking to them about divestment, but they're not fast to jump on anything. So in terms of implementation, eventually we may need to move to a socially responsible firm." And lastly, the fourth construct, processes of change. This table gives you a sense of how those 10 very general processes of change that are part of the TTM can be understood in terms of evidence of leader experience. So basically looking at the specific ways in which these processes of change helped to make sense of the process by which the population that I studied moved through their own behavior change process. And I've chosen to highlight one specific example there, self-reevaluation. And again, that was the desire that individuals had to align investments with mission, vision, values, and grant making. The reflection on their own identity as environmentalists and activists, and for some of them, reflecting on their own prior experience with South African divestment and other forms of socially responsible investing. So just to sum it up, I think most of us at some point early on, or maybe if you're a faculty member, you have students who will say, if people just knew enough, they'd change, right? That's the thing that has been sort of the old theory of change. If we just give people enough information, they'll change. My research has focused on how the TTM framework provides a much more comprehensive approach to understanding and facilitating behavior change. And my study findings support the development, or could support the development, of practitioner tools to support this behavior change by other institutional leaders. So what we know is that that old theory of change doesn't really tell us enough to be effective in facilitating pro-environmental behavior change. First, people have to be ready to make the change. They need to feel that the pros of the change outweigh the cons, and they need to feel confident about their ability to change. And in helping them to really move through the process, those different stages of readiness to engage in a new behavior, there are these 10 general techniques that can be targeted or honed for specific types of behavior. So that's the quick overview. I've got some selected references here that we can go back to and talk more about, or that you might want to look at in more depth. But I want to just say that to bring this to some conclusion and move us into discussion and Q&A, you know, there have been 40 years of empirical psychological research on pro-environmental behavior. And that research has yielded very well-established findings about specific approaches that are effective in promoting pro-environmental behavior. But the results vary based on context, the individuals involved, and the specific behaviors. So context is really important. Identifying and defining the specific behaviors is also essential. And being clear about the specific individuals who are the focus of any behavior change initiative is also critical. So research has surfaced a range of effective techniques. I talked about those earlier: prompts, commitments, feedback, social norms, incentives, and convenience. But as Wes Schultz has been clear to say, considerable uncertainty exists regarding when to deploy these respective tools. And I think what the TTM offers is a theory-driven approach to understanding pro-environmental behavior and some of the ways that we might use that theoretical framework for facilitating specific pro-environmental behavior change. So Joy, I'm going to stop there, and I would love for us to open it up to Q&A and discussion.
All right, thank you. So you'll see that the Q&A is open if you want to type in a question. Somebody just asked if the list of references would be available, and I believe that Terry will make the slides available, or has made the slides available as a PDF for folks, but I'll confirm that with her, and when you get your follow-up email, there'll be information about that. I want to start with a question, Abby, and that's just you know, going back to your last slide before the references. You referred to these 10 general techniques, and my question is, do you mean those R words that you had listed on a previous slide?
Yes, I mean those R words. In fact, why don't I just scroll back if I'm able to do that, and we could take a look at those R words again. So those are the 10 processes of change. Now, I took the liberty in my study of renaming the processes of change, because the original TTM terms, which you see there on the left column, consciousness raising, dramatic relief, environmental reevaluation, some of these are a little bit clunky, or at least to me they were a little bit clunky. And so I was interested in renaming or offering some new terms to describe those processes of change, and that's what you see in the second column.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. Yeah, let's just leave that slide up there. So, Abby, I don't know if you're seeing the Q&A slide that's coming up. We'll try to answer some of these live. It's about 12:42 now, and then we'll answer other ones either by text or in a follow-up. But I'm interested in this question that Sarah Cooper asked, which is, what are the triggers that move people from one stage to the next? What do you think, Abby?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And so, you know, the way that you see the processes of change listed here in this table also map onto, you know, what are the most important processes of change as someone is moving from pre-contemplation through to contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And so, for example, consciousness raising and dramatic relief are two of the most important processes of change at the very beginning of this process. So if you're talking about people who are in pre-contemplation, consciousness raising, which, you know, basically equates to recognizing that there's a need for change, is really effective at that particular part of the process. So is dramatic relief. We're creating reactions for people to feel strong emotions about the need for change. And then as they move into contemplation, you've sort of gotten them off the dime. You've helped them to move out of pre-contemplation to contemplation. Some of the other processes of change become more important at that contemplation stage, one of which is environmental reevaluation, which is really thinking about what is the impact on others of engaging in your current behavior, and what would be beneficial to others of moving to this new behavior, at the same time being self-reflective and looking at the benefits to yourself of moving from your current behavior to the new behavior. So looking externally, the environmental reevaluation piece, and looking internally, the self-reevaluation piece. And then in contemplation, another really important process of change that's relevant in moving to preparation, helping people to move to preparation, is what Prochaska and his colleagues called social liberation, what I retermed realizing, and that is recognizing that the world around you is changing, and that there are resources available to support the kind of change that you're considering. And so in my specific example of fossil fuel divestment, social liberation was characterized by the recognition by participants that there was a divestment movement, and that the movement organizers were providing resources to make it easy to support the divestment behavior change. And so those specific processes of change can be super helpful in moving people from contemplation to preparation. And then, of course, preparation is making a commitment. So self-liberation, which is the TTM term, the Prochaska term, is basically making a commitment. And then once you get into the action stage, reinforcement management or rewarding, rewards become important, counter-conditioning or replacing old behaviors with new behaviors, and stimulus control or restructuring, right? Those are the processes of change that become most important once a person has moved into action to help them keep going and to move them into maintenance. So there is definitely a progression from the early processes of change that you see here through to the later ones. And helping relationships, as was exemplified in that earlier slide I showed you, helping relationships are important at every step of the process.
Thank you. And, you know, a number of folks are asking more specific questions like resources for really learning more about these, and examples such as you've just given about how do these look like in practice. And we're going to have a follow-up survey at the end of this, but I'm wondering if one of the things we might want to do is either to have a panel or to have a more interactive webinar where we take these kind of general techniques and think about what they might look like with different organizations or from different perspectives.
Yeah, Joy, that's a fantastic idea. And I think, you know, the timing is right for that. You know, there are a lot of good examples that come out of, as I said, studies looking at human health behavior changes. But we really have an opportunity now to think about the relevance of this model for conservation behaviors. I think what you're proposing would be a really great contribution.
Right, and a number of people have asked, you know, specifically, has this been applied to conservation behaviors? I want to say to folks that are asking that this model was developed for change at the individual level. And so one of the things that Abby's done has looked at this at the organizational level. So for those that kind of asked that question about how about the individual level, that there is research on that, and Abby can provide some of that too. So Jean-Leon asked, did you find any association with perceived norms, like everyone is divesting now? Is that something that you looked at or measured for?
That's a great question. So where that came out was, you know, in my study, these organizations were at different stages of readiness to engage in divestment. Some of them were well into maintenance. You know, they had been doing divestment for more than 6 months. They had made the commitment and already implemented it. There were a few organizations in my study that were still at the stage of preparation, and they hadn't yet moved to actually divesting from fossil fuels. And for them, this process of change, focus on social liberation, you know, realizing that the world around you is changing, was really important, because they were not the innovators. If we think about what Brooke Tully is going to talk about next time in the webinar, Diffusion of Innovation, you can think of that bell curve of diffusion of innovation, with innovators and early adopters being at the forefront of the bell curve. The people in my study and the organizations that they represented were some of them the innovators of this behavior change, and some of them were the early adopters. And for some of them who were still in preparation, they were really motivated by realizing that that there were others who had gone before them, and that there was a movement that they could become a part of. And so that was significant. And quite honestly, one of the things that really mattered to some of them was who else was in the population. So there are some very big name foundations that have committed to fossil fuel divestment. And for some of the smaller organizations in my study, that what we might call social norming dimension was of significant importance.
Yeah, that's nice to think about. A couple people have questions about the dynamics of behavior as understood through this model. One attendee is asking if there are possible accelerators. One's asking about drawbacks. And another person is asking about how what we see in individual behavior, where maintenance is not kind of an even keel, or that people kind of go back to an earlier stage. So I'm wondering if you have any insights about what does that look like on an organizational level when people don't go through this in a linear fashion, or when it happens really quickly, or when people get stuck in a stage.
Yeah, I love that question. That's so important because, you know, this model doesn't suggest that change is linear. In fact, it's more of a spiral process, and you can spiral back to earlier stages of readiness in any kind of change process. So, you know, some of the things that that helped these organizations to stay on track during maintenance were making some structural changes, right? So if you look at the bottom of this slide and you look at, for example, stimulus control or restructuring, that final process of change, many of the organizations had formally included fossil fuel divestment in their investment policy statement. So it wasn't just a one-time decision of the board of directors or trustees to divest. They had actually made it a formal, explicit part of their overall investment policy statement. So that was a structural change that was important in terms of supporting maintenance. Another thing that was important and that some of them talked about was, you know, how challenging it might have been to them to remain in maintenance if the performance of their portfolios had decreased. In other words, if divestment was associated with a less robust performance of their investment portfolio. Now, at the time that I was conducting my data collection for this study, not a single one of my participants raised that concern. In fact, it was quite the opposite. A number of my participants talked about the fact that going through the process of divestment of fossil fuels had actually increased and improved the performance of their investment portfolios, partially because they got rid of their coal investments, which tanked around, you know, just after the time that they had divested. It was also a time when oil and gas investments were doing less well. And not only were they divesting from fossil fuels, but they were reinvesting those resources, many of them, in clean renewable energy sources. So investing in solar and wind. And those investments had increased in terms of the positivity of the performance. So in my study, there was no data to really help me understand how difficult it might be for them to persist in maintenance with this behavior change if their stocks hadn't done well, because in this case, they had done quite well.
All right, thank you. That's great, Abby. So, you know, one of the questions that I'll kind of reword a little bit has to do with moving from the organizational scale to the social scale. And this means, say, getting the public ready for a change, such as implementation of a carbon tax. Now, I notice in your research, one of the boundaries you set was to engage with organizations who are already at that contemplation stage. If we were starting with another audience or the public where we don't really know where people are, do you have any advice on how we might move through this model in our action?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, you know, one of the things that has been beneficial in this particular movement, the divestment movement, is and which the movement organizers have been very effective in doing, is publicizing the new commitments that are being made as they're being made. And so every time there is a new and significant divestment commitment. The movement organizers are very quick to get the word out publicly through media and through listservs and through other kinds of outreach vehicles to let people know, to provide that feedback that more people are taking action. And so I think for many people on this broadcast, you might be aware that New York City just recently made a commitment to divest pension funds for city employees from fossil fuels. The European Parliament just recently also recommended that all countries within the EU divest from fossil fuels. And so, that's one mechanism for helping to build momentum, is to be highlighting, and again, coming back to that piece somebody asked about earlier about social norming, coming back to really highlighting the actions that are being taken by institutions that may enjoy a broad appeal or credibility. The Catholic Church has also taken steps to divest, and the Pope actually in his encyclical on the environment called for divestment from fossil fuels. So I'm not sure I'm really answering the question, Joy, but that's how I would begin to think about it.
Yeah, that's great. I think there's room for a lot more discussion. We're coming up on time now, so maybe we could move to the last slide. There are two more slides. One is just kind of a reminder for our next webinar. The other is a big thank you for joining us today. We are really excited about doing these webinar series because of the response that we're getting from you. On our last webinar, we did take the unanswered questions and circulated them around to the speakers and others, and prepared a kind of a PDF file that went out to the participants. So if we didn't get to your question, hang on, we'll try to get to it and get you a response to email. We also have an exit survey, and in part it's just your feedback on this webinar, but it's also looking for feedback on the kinds of topics that you'd like, where and when and if you'd like to see additional conservation psychology institutes offered, and if you or your organization are interested in for-credit or non-credit certificate programs in conservation psychology. And with all of those questions, feel free to expand in the text boxes about your particular feedback. So just a reminder, last slide, that we'll be hosting Brooke Tully next month in March for another webinar on creating a conservation movement. She's coming from the social marketing background, so I think many of you had questions about social norms and about extending conservation psychology to social change. We'll find this very helpful. Thanks again, and so long.